Thank you once again to Frank and Andy. I think this is a brilliant initiative, and I can't say that I've had anything to do with it. So I really appreciate the fact that this is very grassroots, if I can put that in inverted commas. It's people who are wanting to know more about interculturalism, who have backgrounds in collaboration and working collaboratively across industries and sectors, who have brought this together. And I think that in itself, to me, is a major achievement, because for really a very long time, we haven't been able to get interculturalism out in this sort of more mainstream forum. And now that's starting to happen. So I'm absolutely delighted about that. Now, there are at least a couple of people, I think Peter and Mariola and possibly Glenda, who have seen some of the slides that I'm going to be using today, because I use them as kind of a basis for the kind of understanding that I really would like people to get. I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academic, so I'll be really clear about that. Although I obviously do a lot of reading about interculturalism, but while those sort of theories sit in the back of my mind, really I look at this from a practice and a policy perspective. So what we're going to be talking about today is to give you some definitions of interculturalism, and to start off really basically around intercultural dialogue. I'll just go through and I don't have a lot of time to do what I might do in a couple of hours. I'll probably be doing in about 15 or 20 minutes. So I will go through, and then if you have questions, you're very welcome to ask them as I go along. Sorry, at the end of this. Can you also currently see, just let me move that off. Sorry, there we go. All right. So what is intercultural dialogue? And really, this is about policy and practice, and interculturalism is about intentionally bringing together people for the purpose of meaningful interaction. So we're not talking about transaction. We're not talking about something like a multicultural festival, for example, where people are on stage, they celebrate and demonstrate their cultural traditions and backgrounds. And then once that dance or once that presentation is over, that they then leave. That it's not about simply seeing that. We want to see that, we want to celebrate that, but we also want the opportunity for meaningful and purposeful interaction. And so that could be through conversations, through things like the People Are Stories methodology. It could be a whole range of different things. But what we want is for people to have talked to each other and met other people and had a laugh with other people by the time they leave that festival, for example. One of the reasons that we want people to have meaningful interaction is because we want to be reducing fear of the other, which I think we're starting to see more and more. It's always been there, particularly in Australia, but it's certainly been underpinning a whole range of protests recently. And there's a whole lot of political dimensions around why that's happening. Reducing racism. We can also get innovation and new businesses happening. The more diversity we have around a table, the better it is that we can start businesses and better meet new markets and client or customer needs. We can be enhancing social inclusion through people knowing each other and talking with each other, and therefore understanding that somebody needs a job, for example, and so they might have access or knowledge of a job. That kind of employment creates a socially inclusive society, much more than if people are isolated. And also it's around strengthening community resilience and embedding social cohesion. If people don't know each other, they can't possibly form a cohesive society. So interculturalism is also really interesting because it's about three different groups of people who live in Australia. The first are First Nations peoples. The second are people born in Australia, and particularly those from third or more generation European backgrounds, and also people born overseas. So one of the most important elements of interculturalism is it doesn't just focus on overseas born people, which I think traditionally multiculturalism has focused on. And what that's then meant has been that First Nations peoples are very clear that they're not part of a political multicultural agenda. And Australian-born people from third or more generation European backgrounds often don't see themselves as being multicultural. So the issue in this is then that if you're developing a multicultural plan, for example, that doesn't connect with Australian-born people or First Nations peoples, again, you can't possibly be creating a cohesive local government because people don't know each other in order to be able to come together. Interculturalism, and I don't want to go through specifically in detail about this slide, but to highlight a couple of things. It's meant to look really busy because the purpose of interculturalism is that it's about building on multiculturalism so that we're activating multiculturalism, we're activating diversity. And one of the most important elements of interculturalism, and I've heard it so many times that it's interculturalism versus multiculturalism, it isn't. It's multiculturalism, and the extension of that is interculturalism. You can't have an intercultural society with only one culture. So it needs a multicultural society in order to be able to function interculturally. The other thing about interculturalism is that it's very much about intersections. So we're wanting to bring together not just somebody who was born overseas with somebody who's born in Australia or a First Nations person. What we also want is that that person potentially has a disability or is a young person or is LGBTIQ, for example, person who has all of these intersections. So when they stand in front of us, we don't just see their culture, we see the person. One of the problems with interculturalism is that people have told me in the past that they feel a little uncomfortable. They're not always sure that they have the skills that they need in order to bring together people who are from diverse backgrounds, whatever those backgrounds are. So sometimes it does require new skills, but often it doesn't require more resources. It's simply a mindset. And I'm happy to talk offline because some people look at me quite strangely saying, how can it not cost any money? But it's not, it is possible for it to not have to cost you any money. And we can talk about that offline. It has been mentioned, as Frank said, at the federal and state government level. So interculturalism is actually really coming to the fore now since about July of last year. We've been advocating for it since about 2009. So we're delighted that it's starting to happen at the other two levels of government. But basically, the last year's Multicultural Framework review by Dr. Hastalal talked about multiculturalism impacting social cohesion to the point where the term itself has become problematic. And what it's recommending is that intercultural relationships increase the mistrust and suspicion of minority groups. So the next element of it is that we need to be moving, as they've said, to beyond mere tolerance and actively embracing intercultural understanding and appreciation. Earlier, I think last month or maybe September, George Lakakis's Rebuilding Trust for a Multicultural Victoria was released. And again, there are quite a number of references to interculturalism in that. There's actually 14 references, and there were 11 in the Multicultural Framework Review. So this is also very important. It talks about using an intercultural lens within a multicultural framework. So we're pretty happy that they've understood that it's not an either or, it's an and that interculturalism really very much is about activating that multicultural society by bringing people together. And if you look at the definition that they've used below, it's again the one that we've been advocating for a very long time. It's about contact, interaction, exchange of views between individuals or groups, so that there is a mutual understanding of those two groups or five groups, however many there are. The second part of the report also talked about interculturalism, building understanding and trust, breaking down stereotypes and challenges. And then one of the most exciting aspects for me is that the public consultations that they held showed and emphasized the importance of strengthening interfaith and intercultural dialogue initiatives. And it's one thing that I have constantly heard from various communities is that they don't get to meet other people, and certainly not other people who are Australian born third or more generation or First Nations peoples, unless they're working in a particular kind of role in local government, for example, where they're much more likely to meet people from those groups, or unless they're working in a kind of industry where there's a great deal of mixing. But otherwise, people are saying that they really want to meet other people from diverse cultural backgrounds, as well as people who are First Nations or who were born in Australia from European backgrounds. So there's not only now a policy call for this, there's now a community call for it. And so again, from a local government or a not-for-profit organisation perspective, working interculturally is not now only a nice to have, it's actually something that people and governments are calling for. Let's have a quick look at multiculturalism. And again, this is very basic, and there are lots of, conversations that I have with people saying it's too basic, but I just want to do the basics of this. That basically, multiculturalism can overemphasize difference, and we know that. We know that sometimes people are kept in silos in terms of, we might work with the Croatian elderly group on a Wednesday, with the Somalian on a Thursday, with the Greek elderly community on a Friday within our planned activity groups within our aged care services, for example. My question would be, well, at what point will you bring those three groups together? How could you do that every quarter, for example, and just bring in interpreters and ask people to talk about their families, just as an example? So there are ways of being able to bring people from diverse cultural backgrounds together. And it could also be that every 3 months, for example, there are First Nations peoples who come in to talk about First Nations history, 65,000 years of history in Australia, to those particular communities for that quarter. I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to do that kind of work. The other problem with multiculturalism is that it has the unintended consequence, I think, about keeping people separate from new networks. And we know that, as I was saying before, from an intercultural perspective, we know that we need to have networks, expanded networks, to be able to find jobs, understand systems, to get to know each other, to feel safe within our own communities. And it's only when we feel like we're able to say hello to somebody or do something like that, that we actually can feel like we belong and that we feel safe. Sometimes a multicultural framework doesn't allow that to happen. It doesn't encourage it to happen, and sometimes it does. So again, just need to be looking at how we're actually activating multiculturalism. Assimilation. Now, this is really tricky. Assimilation is something that is very, very bad for Australia. It's about lumping everybody into the same circle. So what we're saying is that, and a quick bit of history, is that the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, so it was one of the very, very first acts of Parliament, that the Immigration Restriction Act brought in the White Australia policy, became known as the White Australia policy. And what we wanted until about 1975 was for everyone else around the world to fit into essentially British, European Australia. And we expected that from that point in time, everyone would be like us, whoever us was in that broader British sense. It's a bad thing for Australia, assimilation. It's not something that we want, simply because, first of all, you can't in a multicultural nation, but also because we don't want people leaving their culture at the door. We don't want to lose the celebration and the diversity that we have in Australian society. Now, social inclusion, and I heard a really good example of this, or a good metaphor for this the other day, which is social inclusion is being invited to go to a dance. And then I'll talk about social cohesion in a minute. But really, social inclusion is about me feeling as though I am at the center of a whole range of the kinds of places where I can belong, where I can walk in and people will know my name. Sometimes that might be a place of worship. Sometimes it might be my local cafe. It's a place where I can participate, where I have the opportunity to be able to get to meet people, to learn from them, to understand people more. It's a place where I feel like my dignity is respected and that I feel valued. It's also a place where I can have a voice and influence. And I think that this is really important because often people who don't speak English as a first language, for example, or people who are visibly different in terms of faith or ethnicity, may feel as though they're unable to have that voice and that influence within their own communities. So it's a very important aspect of social inclusion. And then there's also the support. So to be able to get basic needs being met, some of that is about understanding, for example, where you can go to get something to help you with your personal crisis. And then for others, it's about being able to maintain their security. And remember also that the sense of belonging and social inclusion is not always a good thing. It could also be an antisocial activity, such as gangs or other kinds of groups of people who are acting in an antisocial manner, but they've joined that particular group because they want to feel included and have a sense of belonging. So where I talked before about social inclusion being about being invited to the dance, social cohesion, I heard as a metaphor, is essentially being at the dance and dancing your own dance to the same song. And I really like the idea of that we retain our own individuality, we retain all of the elements of ourselves, our culture, our faith, our history, ancestry, but we do that within a broader context of having a common goal as a society. And that sense of belonging is about my connection with my community, but it's also about with my small community, my neighborhood, for example, but it's also about feeling like I'm part of a larger social entity. And some of that is around my social connections at that local level, but it's also about at that much greater level at state, federal government, for example, about being able to expect that I will be respected by governments, that I'll be protected by various laws, and that I'll be able to have a sense of the common good, that there's some kind of direction that I'm having at the local, state, or federal government leadership. And so social cohesion can only happen, as I was saying at the very beginning, if people know each other, if they talk with each other, if they feel safe with each other, where we can share positive experiences and new memories, make new memories, positive memories of each other, and have a laugh, because they're the best ways of being able to create positive memories. We want people to be able to develop external, personal, business, and professional networks. And all of those things, if we do all of these things properly, then people have a sense of belonging. They feel as though they're connected to other people. They feel as though they're connected, not just walking down the street and making eye contact and saying hello, but that they feel as though they're part of the greater neighborhood, region or Australian context. And I think that that's a really important element of the society we live in. And it's also a very important element of what I think are currently the threats to Australian society and the threats to individual people within their own neighbourhoods in terms of racism and prejudice. So I will finish up and hand back, I think, to Frank. Is that right, Frank?
Andy.
Andy?
Andy,
I'll take
okay,
it from
thank
here.
you. Thank you both very much for the opportunity to present today. I appreciate that.
No, thank you, Linda, for a very in-depth and insightful look and explanation on what interculturalism versus multiculturalism versus social cohesion and social inclusion.
Thank you.
So I guess I'll quickly go around the floor and just raise your hand if you have any comments or questions about what Linda's presented. Has anyone got any concerns, any feedback or anything at all?
Questions?
Comments? Anyone in agreement, disagreements?
I have a comment. I think that I think what Linda was talking about is actually really timely. You know, we see so much going on in the world today, where it's clear that there is, a lack of that cohesion. There's too much seeing of the other. So I think that what Linda presented was certainly really clear, but really timely.
I think Angela's got a
Thank
hand
you,
up. Andy?
Did you have your hand up, Angela, or was it just a celebration?
I was just vehemently agreeing.
Thank you. Greg
Cool.
Dodds
So-
may have the.
I
Greg,
think- Greg or Peter?
Peter?
Yeah, I think that what was really valuable was actually the word intentional, because I think sometimes we actually do things, but so the intentional side, but also just thinking in terms of the need for really good facilitation in that process. I was just sort of thinking from a council perspective and what we're thinking through at the moment, how important is that, as you say, creating a safe space where people feel valued, people who don't normally get a voice can feel like they can have a voice and speak up, and in ways that are appropriate for them, really needs a good sense of a strong facilitator to understand that and be able to pick up the nuances and whatever and make people be able to contribute. So just thinking through in terms of what was said, very, very good. It was great. So thanks very much, Linda, for sharing.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Greg, you've unmuted yourself. Have you got a...
Oh, yeah, no, I just want to say that I love everything that you're talking about, and it resonates really well. I mean, I'm often at the moment really exploring it so I can explain it to other people in really short chunks. The difference between even culture and interculture. So I try to break those two words down. Culture, how do we do things? Sorry, how we do things. That's our culture. Interculture, how we create new ways of doing things together. That real connectedness. I'm sort of fixated on that. And obviously I'm in the creative space because we're encouraging across those three pillars, the three-story nation that we are in Australia, to bring people together, to work together, to collaborate, and particularly with the First Nations sort of centre wheel at the moment, because that's the biggest thing I find at the moment. Our uniqueness in Australia is that if we put First Nations within our circles, and we have people from, Vietnam, China, Africa, Europe, wherever, and I'm a sixth-generation convict descendant, we're all working together to learn from each other and sort of share together and create together. So that's just my two bobs worth.
Thank you, Greg.
I might just add one comment. Apologies. Also, I dialed in late, 20 minutes late. I had another appointment. But the slide about First Nations I found quite interesting, because I think we do kind of bucket the European cultures together, and then there's First Nations Australians over here. But some of the displaced migrants coming to Australia and bringing their culture might actually be First Nations from their, from their country.
Correct.
But yeah, it'd be good to explore First Nations in the Australian context with a broader global and all of those, cultures and nations represented here in Australia. Because a lot of the debate about closing the gap is the kind of colonial white Australia versus First Nations, but then there's the whole multicultural element. So yeah, if we approach that as an intercultural thing, it might be easier. I don't know. It'd be an interesting thing to explore.
Linda, do you want to comment on that?
I do. Well, there's two things. One is that I can't remember if in the presentation I said that the prefixes are really important. So multiculture, multi simply means lots of cultures. And it's important then that we look at how do we bring together people from all of those different cultures with First Nations peoples and third or more generation Australian European background people, which is a real mouthful, but we're a group, we're a group. That also need to be included. And so we need to have information and knowledge about other people, just as other people need to have information and knowledge about people who have been here for 6 or 7 generations, for example. So I wanted to say that, but also one of the other reasons that I like the term inter is because it's within cultures. So we would not have refugees if we didn't have racism in basically every culture in the world. So if everyone was happy and we had, good relationships, we would have a very happy world and we wouldn't be dealing with trauma, war, etc. So interculturalism is just as important within nationalities, because there may be and will be very, very many different ethnic groups within many nationalities. So for some of the time, we need to be actually facilitating relationships and healing positive relationships, for example, between different groups of people from the same country. So again, interculturalism is about the three groups currently living in Australia, but it's also often about facilitating relationships for people who have arrived in Australia, who carry those sorts of those wounds or trauma with them. And it's also, one of my colleagues who's within our Mosaic Consultant Collective has been working for very many years in the Northern Territory with First Nations communities and trying to do a lot of intercultural conflict resolution work there as well. Because again, we're talking about historical displacement of people and trauma and war over the years as well. So just to flip back to that as well, Peter.
Thank you for that, Linda. Myself, I have a very interesting sort of perspective on it as well, is around the piece that was around the common good or the common goal. I think that will be very